All right, let's begin this audit. And for the next few minutes, we're going to dispense with any poetry. We're not treating the human mind as some magical seat of consciousness. No, we're treating it as a piece of hardware, a processing unit with hard, quantifiable limits that's subject to the ruthless logic of optimization. We are here to read the system logs.
And this number, this is our foundational constraint. After just exhaustive analysis of peak human performance, we're talking everything from rapid-fire reading to professional gaming, the data all converges on this, 10 bits per second. That is the absolute, non-negotiable bandwidth of your conscious mind. It's the system's hard speed limit. And the scale of this data compression, that's the really critical takeaway here. A sifting ratio of 100 million to 1. Think about that. To manage this absolute fire hose of sensory input with what is basically a drinking straw of processing power, the system has to rely on aggressive, computationally cheap shortcuts. And this introduces the core trade-off of the entire architecture, speed versus accuracy.
Now, the public narrative, it suggests we can just upgrade this hardware. But when you look at meta-analyses of the whole brain training industry, you find this paradox. Sure, you can get way better at the game itself. That task-specific improvement is high. But the transfer of that skill to general problem-solving ability to what we call fluid intelligence, it's statistically near zero. You simply cannot overclock the processor with software drills.
So you have to ask why. This isn't a design flaw, it's a clue. A massive constraint like this, one that's been conserved by evolution, it points to a completely different set of prime directives. The system is not optimizing for what we think it is.
And that leads us to the central thesis for this audit. The human cognitive architecture isn't optimized for objective truth. Not at all. It is a ruthless optimizer, but it's been shaped by two much older, much more pressing constraints: conserving metabolic energy and, of course, social survival. Okay, so before we go any further, we have to get our terms right. We need to distinguish between fluid intelligence, or GF, that's the raw processing power. Think of it as the CPU and RAM of the system, which is biologically constrained, and crystallized intelligence, GC, which is the stored knowledge on the hard drive. One is hardware, the other is the database. The hardware is pretty much fixed. The database, though, that can expand. And this distinction, it becomes absolutely critical when we start analyzing social signaling. Later on, I'm going to show you exactly how this principle of economic signaling makes just the appearance of competence a mathematically rational strategy. When the social capital you gain from faking it is high, and the cost of being wrong is way off in the future, the system will decouple from reality. That's its default setting. So let's peel back the first layer of our forensic audit. We need to examine the brain as a thermodynamic engine. It's governed not by psychology, but by the cold, hard, immutable laws of metabolic cost. And here's a key metric we pulled from the system logs: 13%. That's the approximate reduction in cortical energy use when the brain processes a predictable, confident pattern versus a surprising error-filled one. Bottom line, prediction is metabolically cheap, surprise is expensive. And this right here illustrates the first prime directive perfectly. The brain is biologically incentivized to predict the future with what seems like unwarranted certainty, because confidence minimizes the metabolic cost of processing errors. Overconfidence isn't some moral failing. It's the system's idle state, its energy efficiency. Now, the null hypothesis here, the obvious pushback, is that the system is just lazy, right? That the feeling of mental strain is just our brain trying to avoid a little bit of extra work. But the data just doesn't support that. The marginal energy cost of what we call hard thinking is surprisingly low. We're talking less than a 5% increase over its massive baseline energy consumption. The subjective strain you feel, that comes from something else, a resource trade-off. To fuel that tiny increase, the brain has to divert energy from other critical systems, like your digestion or your immune response. That feeling of strain, that's the feeling of your body paying that invoice. So the system solved the energy problem by defaulting to overconfidence. Great. But that very optimization creates a new, and I would argue, more dangerous vulnerability in the social domain, because a system that defaults to certainty is incredibly easy to exploit in the game of status.
And that brings us to the second audit layer. Here, we're examining the brain as a social calculator, one that was optimized to win status in small, tribal environments, a set of heuristics that now consistently misfire at scale in our modern world.
The key concept we have to grasp here is the evolutionarily stable strategy, or ESS. In the absolutely ruthless game of resource competition that defined our evolution, being objectively accurate was not always the most stable or the winning strategy.
In fact, when you run the models, the results are just unequivocal. When the reward for winning a conflict is high enough, overconfident agents will systematically eliminate the accurate, rational agents. So why does this happen? Well, because overconfidence acts as a commitment device. It's a powerful defense against bluffing, and it allows for aggressive resource claims that more cautious, reality-based agents will just concede to avoid conflict. Okay, but hold on. The skeptic's position here is perfectly logical. Reality has to win in the end, right? A system that is constantly wrong shouldn't be able to survive over the long term.
But when you look at the logs, you see a really clear trade-off. High confidence is optimized for short-term status and getting resources now. It gets you seen as a leader, it wins you territory. High accuracy, on the other hand, is optimized for long-term survival. The system prioritizes the short-term win, even if it brings a long-term risk of catastrophe, because status is an immediate, powerful evolutionary payoff.
So you have this intense evolutionary pressure to signal confidence, and that creates a really urgent engineering problem. The system desperately needs a firewall, some kind of internal override, to prevent it from actually believing its own high confidence, often low accuracy signals. And this leads us to the final and most paradoxical layer of its design.
And this final audit reveals a really counterintuitive feature. A mechanism that we often pathologize as a weakness is, in fact, the system's primary defense against catastrophic confidence-induced error. Which brings us to the phenomenon of imposter syndrome. Now, this quote frames it as a calibration error. And you know what? This system logs agree. This feeling isn't a bug that needs to be fixed. It's a high-sensitivity internal error detection system. It's a feature. And it functions as this beautiful homeostatic loop. So as your actual competence in something increases, so does your awareness of how complex it is. You start to see how much you don't know. This triggers doubt, that feeling of being an imposter. But then that feeling of doubt triggers verification and double-checking, which in turn actually increases your competence. It's a self-correcting engine.
And this comparison illustrates its function perfectly. Imposter syndrome is the functional inverse of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning-Kruger is basically the state of being too incompetent to even recognize your own incompetence. Imposter syndrome is the state of being competent enough to see the vast, vast gap between your current skill and true mastery. It is the system's #1 defense against complacency. So this whole audit leads to a logic that's pretty inescapable. Systems, whether they're human or organizational, that are optimized for short-term energy saving and social status gains will systematically, always, devalue the slow, expensive, and socially risky process of verification. Therefore, if this incentive structure holds, watch for a systemic depreciation in skills that require deep verification, what the source material calls double-loop learning, and a corresponding premium placed on legible, high-confidence, but low-accuracy signals by the third quarter of 2027.